So, good morning. Welcome to our panel discussion today on education, cultural heritage, and Indigenous peoples' economic development. With that long title, what I just would like to say to everybody is that what we're hoping to cover today is to focus on positive models of Indigenous development, the greening of the economy, conservation, employment, livelihoods, and how Indigenous communities around the world are innovating and contributing to progress on all of these fronts. So again, welcome everybody to all of our distinguished panelists. And briefly, I would like to ask everybody to introduce themselves. So first, let's begin with Simon Bracoupe. Welcome.
Kwei, Simon Bracoupe. I'm acting president and CEO of the First Nations Education Administrators Association. Good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you. Fawn Sharp.
Oh, Yohach Unshek Hiwishka Chikatsi. Good day. My name is Fawn Sharp. I'm a citizen of the Quinault Indian Nation, a tribal nation on the coast of Washington State in the United States. I formerly served as president of the National Congress of American Indians, the oldest and largest representative body of more than 574 tribal nations in the United States. I also served as a 5-term president of my tribal nation, the Quinault Indian Nation, and it's truly an honor and a privilege to be here. Thank you, Siokwel.
Thank you for being here today. Diana Pizarro.
Hi, yes. My name is Diana Pizarro. I'm the Global Coordinator for Indigenous Peoples at the World Bank, based in Washington, D.C., but actually also born on the Swinomish tribe in Washington State, where Fawn is from as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Harry Petrinos.
Thank you. I'm Harry Petrinos, Senior Advisor Education at the World Bank. I'm also an economist.
Thank you also for being here. So I'd like to begin today with a question for Simon. If you could give us a brief overview of how Indigenous community values are taken into account or promoted and strengthened as part of the work that you do. And then if you could also tell us, what do you think is the single most important thing that governments can do, either do or can do, both national and international, to support your work?
Okay, it's a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to skip the PowerPoint, so I'm just going to because it's going to take longer than 5 minutes to go through that. So, anyways, I'll reintroduce myself. Kwei, Simon Bracoupe. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. It's a topic that is close to my heart and interests. I'm from Gitigan-Zibi First Nations, which is about an hour and a half north of Ottawa, the capital of Canada. And I'm going to talk about education and entrepreneurship and the dynamic changes that are happening today in Canada. So if you look at Community Wellness Index, you can see that Indigenous people are their Community Wellness Index is improving, but there's a gap between Canadians and Indigenous people, as you might imagine. But there is improvement, and I think education is part of that. And certainly in the last 20, 30 years, education for Indigenous people has greatly improved. In the 70s, when I was going to school, I think there were 67 people that we knew of that had graduated from university. And if you were a university graduate, you were worshipped by a lot of people in the community. So there has been a significant increase in the last little while. On the entrepreneurship side, Indigenous people are starting businesses at 5 times the rate of Canadians. So there's a significant change and trend that's important to understand. In the 1990s, I did a study on small businesses in Indigenous communities. And what I found was Indigenous entrepreneurs were starting businesses to provide employment for their relatives and their community and benefit to the community at large. So entrepreneurship, I think, is a bit different. It's growing very rapidly. Community and culture is critically important. And today, youth and female entrepreneurs are making a significant change in development in Canada. So we have a lot of Indigenous youth starting youth enterprises. One is She Native Goods Incorporated, and it's an enterprise that focuses on empowering Indigenous women by providing them with employment opportunities and promoting positive representation of Indigenous culture. Another business called Nietzsche Gear is run by Kendall Netmaker, and the profits from Nietzsche Gear supports underprivileged youth to participate in sports. And it's the way he gives back to the community. So there's a lot of businesses like that across Canada. The number of Indigenous sustainable energy enterprises has greatly increased. The latest data that I found was that there are more than 200 clean energy projects across Canada. And these are sort of larger ones, but there are many small projects. So there could be 500, and a lot of communities are very interested in solar energy. And there's an organization called First Nations Major Project Coalition, and they've invested over $17 billion in clean energy, natural resources, and infrastructure, with a goal of the transition to low carbon economy. There's a wind energy farm in New Brunswick, and what I found interesting about it was that they're investing in profits into new housing, road repairs, drinking water protection, and waste water diversion. So a lot of these communities projects are critically important. I think anybody that works in this area should have a look at the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development. They have identified 4 critical factors: that sovereignty matters, institutions matter, culture matters, and leadership matters. And I just wanted to focus a bit on the work that Manly Bigay has done on cultural match. So he is saying that institutions should fit or match their community's culture, their values. And I think when I think about it, over the last 40 years, there's been a shift. 40 years ago, Indigenous people were concerned about getting into Western type enterprises, because of the negative view that they had with them. But today, there's been a lot of shift and change to having community enterprises that are based on Indigenous culture, values, and traditional knowledge. When we look at traditional knowledge, we know that Indigenous lands make up 20% of the world's territory, and that 80% of the world's biodiversity is in these Indigenous territories. So it's great support for Indigenous knowledge as being a way of the future. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People support development that's based in Indigenous culture. In Canada, they have passed an act last year called the United Nations Declaration Act. And one of the priorities is supporting traditional economies. And it's an interesting change that we're seeing even in governments. There are a number of education leaders. Dr. Kyle Bobbiwash, for example, teaches at University of Manitoba, but he is integrating traditional knowledge and science. So he's a leader in this area. He's not the only one. There are several others like Dr. Emily McCauley, who works at the federal government, and she's promoting the incorporation of traditional knowledge and practices in science. So the other, I know you want to ask me a question, but here's the answer to your question. You can ask me the question.
Actually, I didn't have a question. I just wanted to jump in and say that I think I'm going to come back to you for the second question, given the time. If you can wrap up, and save my second question about the role of governments for when we come back in the second round, just because time has elapsed.
Okay, so
thanks.
So just to wrap up on this idea of the relationship between Indigenous education and economic development, when we look at the factors in Canada, we're looking at cultural values and traditions, education and training that's rooted in Indigenous education principles like holistic thinking, place-based experiential learning, sustainability concerns, land rights and natural resources, market access, networks and supports, and legal and political frameworks. So all these things are contributing to the change that we are seeing today. A lot of organizations are saying we need more investment and we need to reinforce Indigenous peoples' land rights and rights to natural resources.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Simon. I'm sure we'll come back to many of the topics that you've just raised. I'd like to turn now to Fawn. Thank you again for being with us today. And I'd like to start with this question for you. You work in a particularly, at least to me, interesting nexus between Indigenous community economic development, environmental stewardship, and political representation of Indigenous communities. And you've done that both nationally and internationally. And so from this particular vantage point, I'd love to hear from you what you see as some of the greatest success stories that you know of for Indigenous peoples, and what are the key ingredients to replicating or growing those going forward?
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate that question. And I think before I answer the specific parts of your question, I think it's going to be incredibly valuable to provide a basic background on my tribal nation, how I emerged into leadership, and what really motivated as well as inspired me to go to the places that you described. So my tribal nation is currently under multiple states of emergency due to sea level rise, due to the collapse of our sacred salmon, our fisheries. And during my presidency, I got elected back in 2006. That very first year, we faced a storm. It was considered to be the storm of the century, the December 1st storm in the Pacific Northwest. We lost power for 8 days. During that same year, I also stood on our beach and saw 2 miles of dead marine life due to oxygen depletion. I took a helicopter flight over the Olympic Mountains and saw the glaciers that feed the mighty Quinault River completely disappearing. And so I was confronted in my first term as president of my nation with being on the front lines of the climate crisis way back in 2006. And it was at that point that I began to realize that it was going to be critically important to develop a strategy that was not just developed in a vacuum within my nation, but it required regional, national, and international thinking to really solve the crisis. The more I got to know about ocean acidification, the warming ocean temperatures. And so it was in that sort of background in which I began to do research, began to do policy work. I started to advance pricing carbon in the United States, which we achieved in the Climate Commitment Act in the state legislature here in Washington. I knew that the treasury of the public, whether in our community here in the state of Washington, in Olympia, the Washington State Legislature, or in the United States Congress, we knew way back then that the public treasury was simply going to it wasn't going to be to the scale of resources that we were going to need. The public treasury is simply paying for the symptoms of climate change, the hurricanes, the tornadoes, the mega fires. And so part of the success that we created was wanting to have best science drive our decisions. How can we really achieve what we need to do both at Quinault and in our advocacy around state, federal, and international policy? So I think that was the most important thing that we could really do. There's no question Indigenous peoples have a very clear vision of a prosperous, healthy, sustainable, clean future. We've lived that way for centuries. And there's no question that we could also see some of the failures of those around us in not managing a healthy relationship with each other, with the planet, with the oceans, with the forests. And so part of our success really has been to bring to the table an Indigenous perspective around lifeways and not just ecological relationships. There is an underlying spiritual relationship that we carry, that we've inherited, and that we're determined to pass on to the next generation. And I think those around us are starting to really understand the value of that connection. As my colleague pointed out, 5% of the population on the planet governs and oversees 80% of the biodiversity, what's remaining. And I often flip that to say we're outperforming everyone else by 400% and with resources. So imagine what we could do if we were resourced. Imagine what we could do if we could educate the global community about our perspective. Because as we see it today, the global community is beginning to monetize and value nature as a natural asset. And the more the climate crisis intensifies, the more there's going to be a look at how can we really support natural solutions. And so we need to ensure that there's an Indigenous perspective in valuation, and also as well as looking at accountability and reporting. We know we could create a gold standard for investors who are looking to make concrete investments that are going to return. And so some of those success stories that we've already been able to build, we know that in the United States, we have the opportunity to not only bring 574 tribal nations directly to the table with the United States and other countries, diplomats around the world, but we can really provide a best practice solutions that are proven through centuries. And then once we're able to create those type of success stories here in the United States, we have a broad network to export that success all around the world. And so we know the world is hungry for solutions. We know the world is starting to understand the value of Indigenous peoples. And we've been preparing for centuries to bring our knowledge to bear, to be part of the solution. And as we've proven time and time again, when we're able to succeed in our communities, those around us succeed. Many of us here in the United States are leading employers in our states and in our counties. And so we know that we're going to continue to build on that economic growth, create jobs, create opportunities, but in a way that's sustainable, that will last centuries into the future, because our North Star is providing for 7 generations out. And so that's the type of success we've achieved, the type of success we hope to share, not only with other tribes here in the United States, but Indigenous peoples around the world. Siokwe, thank you.
Thank you, Fawn, very much. And again, you've raised many topics that I hope we will have time to come back to after the first round of introductions and questions. So I'd like to turn now to Diana. Thank you again for joining us this morning. And I would love for you to give us just a brief overview of how thinking at the world and work at the World Bank has evolved with and for Indigenous communities over time. And then if you can tell us about a particular project or initiative at the bank that you think best exemplifies the potential role for the bank going forward in working with Indigenous communities.
Sure, Gillette, thank you so much. So I think to start out with, we have to think of the evolution of thought from the World Bank, which is important because the World Bank is a financier and a respected partner of many states of the world, and guiding policy and providing technical assistance to governments around their policy, around their investments, and also serving as sort of setting the standard for other development agencies and bilateral. So when we go back to what is our evolution of or approach with Indigenous peoples, is I think we can go back to 1982 when the World Bank adopted its first operational directive 2.34 on tribal peoples that were living in relatively isolated areas. The directive in 1982 didn't speak necessarily to direct participation of these peoples. It was quite paternalistic in nature and protecting, safeguarding their interests and preventing harm. From there, in 1991, the World Bank adopts the Directive 4.20, where the involvement of Indigenous peoples and project-affected Indigenous peoples is introduced. So it's not just we need to make sure they're safeguarded, but they need to be involved in deciding what are the impacts and preventing the harm. And that directive in 91 also introduced the idea of benefits, so that Indigenous people it's not just a risk issue, but also should be participating in benefits. We then in 2005 upgraded directive to a policy, an institutional policy 4.10, that went much farther in elaborating the consultation and participation requirements. At that point, the World Bank adopted free prior informed consultation with broad community support. We didn't go as far as the Indigenous peoples movement was hoping on consent at that point, but we also at that point spoke to social culturally relevant benefits as an equal objective to the doing no harm within that policy. And it was at that point the only safeguard policy that the World Bank had that specifically recognizes human rights as part of the objectives. In 2016, we're now where we are today with our current environmental and social framework, which continues to have a standalone standard for Indigenous peoples and sub-Saharan African historically underserved traditional local communities. The international negotiation around our standard adopted that terminology, as well as adopted a greater flexibility in the terminology of different tribal groups and ethnic minorities that would be recognized meeting certain criteria of how the World Bank defines Indigenous peoples. But in this standard, we also finally adopted free prior informed consent, which is a critical right for self-determination for Indigenous peoples in the projects we finance. That standard in 2016, adopted in 2016, is now currently active in 32% of the World Bank's investment portfolio throughout the world in over 50 countries. So as you can see, that's a bit the evolution of the institutional policy framework. But I think beyond the policy framework of what is required for the loans that we finance to governments is how the World Bank is working with Indigenous peoples. Over the last 2 decades, as you know very well, we started with critical flagship analytical pieces to reveal sort of Indigenous peoples as being poor, right? Overlaying Indigenous people's poverty and access gaps to and inequality in sharing in the benefits of development. But to today, where we are actually trying to evolve our direct financing mechanism to Indigenous peoples as partners in climate and nature. We have so far had 3 direct financing mechanisms, grant mechanisms that go to Indigenous peoples to build capacity for Indigenous peoples and voice in international and national policy dialogue around climate change. We've had a whole forest investment program dedicated grant mechanism that delivers around $4 to $5 million in 12 different countries, and that's now expanding to other countries. For Indigenous peoples, where Indigenous peoples are at the seat, the steering committee, making the choices around and priorities around what will be financed, and actually managing those funds directly. And now we have a third sort of generation of that type of direct financing through Enable, which is a fund working to support Indigenous people's voice and inclusion in our emission reduction programs. In addition to the direct financing mechanisms, we also support policy dialogue at national, regional, and global levels with Indigenous leaders directly, and to the extent possible, bringing countries and state actors into these dialogues where Indigenous peoples are having an upstream voice around what development should look like in their country, what well-being looks like. And I think now, one last piece that I'd like to add is the World Bank, which is known to be an institution filled with economists focused on monetary measures of well-being, has now just recently adopted in our mission statement, not just monetary related indicators of, as it was before, a world free of poverty, but now a world free of poverty on a livable planet. And I think that move by the World Bank and the adoption of principles around a sustainable planet to live in reframes the role of Indigenous peoples vis-a-vis and their voice and their seat at the table, our institution, the importance of Indigenous peoples' guidance and knowledge and vision for the world in how we do development moving forward. So I think that there has been shifts in many different fronts, from the institutional policy requirements to working and investing in spaces to open voice at policy dialogue, national, regional, global levels, to direct financing mechanisms, to even, and here I'll go to your second question, Gillette, on an example of how can the World Bank, what sets the World Bank apart to be able to make a difference with Indigenous peoples and not for Indigenous peoples. An example I'd like to pull from Panama, in 2012, the Panamanian government reduced Indigenous peoples' rights within their autonomous territories to consultation on projects that were affecting them. And that resulted in a massive movement of Indigenous peoples to protest those policy reforms, which resulted in violence and a confrontation where 2 people died and 89 people were put in the hospital. For some countries, that type of violence isn't that big of a deal. In Panama, it's a big deal. That resulted in a national roundtable where the Catholic Church and then the UNDP stepped in to facilitate a national dialogue to design an Indigenous peoples development plan. In 2014, that development plan was approved by all of the 12 Indigenous councils and congresses. However, there was a change in government. And during that change of government, the World Bank, through our systematic country diagnostic, which is our upstream analytical piece to define what are the key development priorities for a country, we were able to focus in on the significant inequalities and gaps that Indigenous peoples faced in the country and the need to do something different. And that doing something different, we felt needed to put the Indigenous Peoples National Development Plan in the center and the existing roundtable as a permanent consultative mechanism. And we provided technical assistance in that space for 1.5 years until the government of Panama requested an $80 million investment loan to finance the National Indigenous Peoples Development Plan. We then supported that process, and the development plan is now implementing. But beyond just investing in it, through our policy dialogue, we were able to achieve, one, that the National Roundtable was legally institutionalized as a formal platform for consultation and dialogue between the government and Indigenous authorities in the country. We were able to ensure that Indigenous women had a seat at that table. And we were also then, finally, through another policy loan, able to secure that the Indigenous National Development Plan would be converted into a national policy that then, despite or regardless of a World Bank loan, would continue over time as part of the state of Panama's engagement with Indigenous peoples and recognition for the need to invest in their territories based on their own priorities. So this is an example that I highlight because it's a space where the World Bank has leveraged its investment capacity, its technical knowledge and experience from working across many countries in the world with Indigenous peoples, its ability to serve as a convening sort of a third party, legitimate party to bring Indigenous authorities and government to the table, and its ability to walk with the government, hold the government's hand and the Indigenous people's hand throughout the process to overcome hurdles like procurement and financial management and transparency and transference of government from one party to another political party. So this is where I think, whereas many institutions in the world can mobilize funding to Indigenous peoples directly, and maybe in much more agile ways than the World Bank can, and other institutions serve for global policy debate, we have a plethora of tools that, when working together and in good faith, can serve to really bring Indigenous peoples to the table with their authorities, and can look for technical innovations that recognize Indigenous peoples' unique contributions and knowledge, but at the same time, technologies and innovations and development practice that can move the needle in spaces that are so critical, not just for Indigenous peoples, but for our world's well-being and sustainable way forward. And I'll leave it at that, Jill. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Diana. It's so interesting to start to see the through lines between the work that each of you do. And so I'll turn now to Harry Patrinos. If you could build on the three previous interjections, and tell us, you're such a strong researcher in this field. If you could start with an overview, building on particularly what Diana has said, of the role of research and particularly policy research in our understanding and drawing attention to Indigenous peoples' development, both needs and capacities, and also what you see as the particularly most impactful questions that research could help answer going forward.
Thanks, Jill. And I think where I will start is by saying that I believe that Indigenous peoples' stewardship of the environment, leadership, and knowledge, as people have said already today, are critical for finding solutions to the climate crisis, reversing biodiversity loss, and advancing a more sustainable relationship with our planet. But my first entry into this area was long ago, when the bank was preoccupied with poverty reduction, and early work on comparing countries and communities. And we did some work on Indigenous peoples, and we found what we did on extreme poverty, that Indigenous people, numbering somewhere 475 million people around the world, maybe 6% of the world's population, but 19% of those living in extreme poverty. And the assessment that we did, covering many countries in the developing world, Africa, Asia, Latin America, about 85% of the Indigenous populations. And we looked at indicators, compared Indigenous and non-Indigenous in the country where they live. And pretty stark poverty numbers that I mentioned compared to the national averages. But we did see that in Asia, there had been significant and rapid poverty reduction among both groups. But in Latin America and Africa, stagnation. So what we need to do going forward, we may want to update the numbers that we have. I think from a cursory look, it's not going to change drastically. The 77th session of the United Nations concluded in a report that Indigenous people still suffer from poverty, but also climate change and the loss of ancestral lands. And all of that matters. It's not just the poverty numbers, it's the land and the climate. So going forward, research needs to address many of the issues that people talked about today. about the biodiversity, climate, livable planet, but also the employment problem, the problem of communities and their well-being. And rather than look at it the way we did back when we started this poverty work 20 some years ago, look at it in terms of what the contributions are of Indigenous people. I think Simon already mentioned that Indigenous people are on 85% of the world's biodiversity. We have plenty of evidence about the management of lands and contributions to the environment. But research also needs to document what can be done by communities to improve their own economic well-being and what needs to be done from the policy side to make this a better situation. Some facts: Indigenous communities are on the rise. Navajo Nation in the US, one of the largest tribal governments in North America, a land base larger than the state of West Virginia. Indigenous entrepreneurship is growing globally. Simon gave examples. In Canada, Indigenous businesses contribute more than $12 billion annually to the country's GDP and employ over 400,000 people. Indigenous-owned enterprises creating economic and social value. The Seminole Tribe of Florida purchased Hard Rock Cafe in 2007. They now have venues in more than 68 countries around the world. Indigenous ventures are creating quality jobs. Cielo, the Federation of Indigenous Business in Mexico, represents more than 180 ventures of Indigenous peoples creating jobs in their own communities. And Indigenous activities promote local economic development, which prevents migration, which also helps value their own lands. At the same time, these organizations improve earnings and provide higher incomes for the communities. Simon mentioned other industries. Let me just mention tourism. Indigenous people involved in tourism can promote their own development, strengthen their institutions, culture, at the same time generate revenue to support their social and economic growth, prevent youth from leaving the communities, giving youth a chance to develop their skills and to give them opportunities to do more. But there are barriers to Indigenous economic development. I'll mention just a few of these, and I think more research needs to go into this. Access to capital, loans. In many Indigenous communities, at least in North America, there are barriers to getting commercial capital. There's a lack of public investment on Indigenous lands, the lack of relevant education. Simon spoke to this point, and Fawn as well. The education system needs to adapt to what's needed for local economic development and to value that Indigenous knowledge and traditional culture in the system. The lack of relevant healthcare for particular Indigenous communities, and in many countries, the lack of recognition of Indigenous lands. The UN talked about the loss of ancestral lands. There are many communities that don't have formal recognition of their land. And to make all of that even more difficult, there's a lack of data about many of these aspects. Most of the statistics that I gave come from North America. We need a lot more work on this model rather than just looking at the gaps, which I'm sure are there, but we need to look at how Indigenous controlled enterprises can promote Indigenous economic development while at the same time doing the things that Fawn and Simon and Diana talked about, preserving the land, contributing to a better environment, and bringing back some of the biodiversity. And that would require economic and education systems that are different, but are also promoting the kind of social and economic development that we believe is important. A final point about we're talking about the World Bank earlier. Official development assistance. not just World Bank, but all development assistance, less than 1% of official development assistance is allocated to Indigenous peoples' economic development. So a lot needs to change. We need to develop a model, an economic and social model that would explain why giving Indigenous people more control over their lands, enterprises, would produce benefits for them and for the world through the preservation of the environment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have in mind several questions for the rest of you, but again, given the strength of the experience and expertise on this panel, I'd like to take a moment to open it up to each of you to either highlight and draw out what others have said or ask a direct question for follow-up to one of the panelists. So could I start with Simon?
Yeah, the stories we're hearing are consistent throughout. And I guess I'd like to ask a question about the struggle that communities have in delivering education that is culturally relevant and meaningful at the community level. I think Harry had talked about that. But I was going to ask Fawn, what has been your experience as a leader in Canada? We call it First Nations control of First Nations education. And I think if we have that, we can also influence development in a very positive way. So that's a question for Dawn or Fawn. Sorry, Fawn.
Yes. Thank you. I think one of the things that we're finding in my nation in particular, our elders who had a vision for investing in education knew that we were going to have a day of reckoning, such as the day that we're in right now, where we were going to not only need to know how to navigate communities outside of ours, but we needed to bring to bear our knowledge to those conversations, as well as bring outside knowledge internally. And so it was a two-way vision. And so back in the 70s, our tribal leaders made a significant investment in education. We also then championed this notion of self-governance. It was quite a radical idea back in the 1980s that rather than just simply managing federal dollars, we would compact federal dollars as a direct block grant so that we could then shape how we wanted to spend those education dollars. And so that proved to be very successful. My tribe was one of 6 self-governance demonstration projects. It later became permanent legislation in the United States Congress. And I'll just give you one example of during my tenure as president, we created a Quinault language department, and we funded a Quinault citizen to earn her PhD in linguistics. Upon graduation, we were able to create a pipeline so she was able to come back home, lead the Quinault language department, and we now have certified teachers. We now have Quinault language in our Head Start programs offered to the community at large. We're doing multimedia work. And so a tribal citizen born into this generation can now learn to speak the Quinault language. And so that's just one example of how we are taking our vision for what we need in terms of education, looking at understanding our history, our language. We're moving into some traditional foods and medicines. The pandemic proved to be an opportunity where we could work with the federal government to receive funding to not just provide medical care, because we had the highest rates of infection, the highest COVID death rates, but we found that some of our traditional foods and medicines were quite effective. And so those are some ways in which we are leading not only the public policy and influencing an ability for us to make our own decisions, grow and expand the idea of self-governance, and then take resources and shape those to meet our vision and have the support to do that.
Very interesting. Thank you both. So I'm just going to keep to the original order here. So I'm going to stick with Fawn and now ask you, what in particular struck you of the comments from the other panelists, and or what question might you have for one of the other panelists for follow-up?
Yes, thank you so much. This is an incredibly valuable opportunity and time. I've worked in the international spaces, as I said, since back in 2007. And I've often felt as though I've been all alone going into these different places, into a world where very few Indigenous leaders are in these different places from the United States. I've seen Indigenous leaders from other parts of the world, but my own experience has me wondering, just from others and their lived experiences, how can the global community really support tribal nations who want to enter into international trade and commerce? A lot of work is done around protecting human and civil rights, advancing public policies like free, prior, and informed consent. But what I found is we have an opportunity to influence economies inside the United States, but also partner with the global community to influence externally economic, social, and political public policy with the United States as a partner. And so I'll give you one example of where we found some success, and I see it as an opportunity for decades to come. We were able to look at cap and trade, for example, back in 2008. The global market was trading at $32 a metric ton. The domestic market here in the United States was trading at $2 to $3 a metric ton through a voluntary system of the Chicago Climate Exchange. There was an exchange in New England, one in California. But the reason domestic companies could not access those markets, the United States was not a signatory to the Kyoto Protocol. However, a tribal nation could enter into those markets. And so we found points of entry and opportunity for tribal nations to sort of rise above public policy barriers for those markets where we knew there are solutions, and we knew we need to bring that to the United States, bring foreign investment that otherwise would not come to the United States in partnership with tribal nations. And so while I saw just a glimmer of that, I know that's part of the solution of what we need to advance going forward. We need to not only bring Indigenous knowledge to the global business community, we need to take and export our political standing across the United States to help influence as a matter of domestic policy, but also as a matter of foreign policy, so that we could monetize tribal sovereignty to continue to make advancements and overcome barriers.
Very interesting. And I'm wondering, Diana, if you might have something to add in response to what Fawn has just said. And in particular, I wonder, when you mentioned this new initiative of direct financing mechanisms, where Fawn is talking about seeing this window opening up where the tribal community was able to access an international market, going sort of, even though the US hadn't been a signatory to the Kyoto Protocol. The question that comes to my mind, at least, is there seems to be some bubbling of scope for Indigenous communities to work either directly with international communities or markets, and what you might have to add to that conversation.
As you know, I mean, as a world, speaking for the World Bank, our mandate is to finance governments. So, exactly. And governments are, we're a cooperative of states that were formed after World War II to help rebuild countries. So in that mandate, we have been quite limited in our capacity, at least from the public sector side of the World Bank, to mobilize and engage direct financing with private sector. We have a private sector arm, which is called the International Finance Corporation, but from where I sit, our primary counterpart are states now, and also developing states, right, Fawn? So we don't tend to work we don't work really in the United States, but the type of knowledge, for example, that Simon mentioned from the Harvard Project, or your experience, is of great wealth for other Indigenous nations and peoples in the developing world, where we would like to bring that type of cross exchange and learning as a starting point. So I think that's a limitation to what I can say as far as the World Bank is ready to invest in with tribes in sort of private sector deals. However, as Jill very rightly notes, there is a movement among the international development community to find ways to mobilize more direct financing to Indigenous peoples and to finance the underlying rights conditions, for example, secure land tenure and security over natural resources, that are critical for not necessarily for an end goal of profit, but for an end goal of conservation and climate mitigation, Fawn. And in that, what the World Bank has been doing with the direct financing mechanisms, for example, this enable, is we are looking to, we have a results-based finance instrument that finances a state's commitment to reduce emissions through forests, for example, and forest conservation and reducing forest degradation. And when the government receives those funds, at the end of the day, the frontline stewards are most often Indigenous peoples, right? And so what the World Bank in the design of this mechanism of emission reductions programs has done has required that the government adopt a benefit sharing plan, and the direct financing mechanisms so that the funds, hopefully in their majority, flow directly to the communities, to the farmers, to the Indigenous peoples that are changing practices, conserving the resource, and thus creating the emission reduction. And the direct financing mechanism that I mentioned seeks to create the enabling environment so that those Indigenous peoples or women or migrants that live in the forests that may not have identity cards, are marginalized from the system, have an opportunity to learn about how to access these funds and get into a place where they can actually participate in the benefit sharing plans. Now, this is a first step of direct finance, but I think what Fawn's speaking to is something much bigger, and it is something that the World Bank internally is trying to think about and get our head around. Is it possible within our mandate to create some sort of direct financing instrument that recognizes and compensates and incentivizes Indigenous peoples and other local communities that are very land-based, connect and have collective attachment? Is there an instrument that we can do some sort of direct financing that's not just sharing in the benefits of a government program, but actually incentivizing mitigation action, and also recognizing that climate, despite being one of the least contributors to a changing climate, are among the most affected by changing climate? So I know it's not a perfect answer to what Fawn has raised, because what she's raising goes a bit outside of the mandate of our public side of the institution. But so you're right, Fawn, our focus is more on the policy space. It is more on creating the education opportunities, the health opportunities, closing those equality gaps, but also ensuring that the rights, standards, and safeguards are in place so that Indigenous peoples can exercise their self-determination while continuing to support the world with the stewardship that they are.
Thank you, Diana. And with your, I'm just thinking about your first interjection where you so nicely and succinctly laid out how the World Bank's approach to working with Indigenous peoples and communities has really evolved quite significantly over time. Change is possible. So even though we don't do something today, or an organism doesn't do something today, it doesn't mean that it isn't going to happen in the future. And each of you have laid out in your own ways things that positive change, or as the topic of this panel is focused on, what Indigenous communities are how they are evolving and growing in their impact around the world. So we have probably a maximum of 10 minutes left, probably a little bit less. I'm going to stick to the order. Diana, do you have a question for anybody else on the panel?
Sure, since we're circular in nature, I'll go to Simon. Simon had a data point that I thought was fascinating, that Indigenous peoples in Canada are starting new businesses at a rate of 5 to 1 compared to non-Indigenous Canadians. And I'd like to ask Simon, Simon also referenced the Harvard Project, which looks at the key tenets of Indigenous governance and their successful models of, in North America primarily. Simon, what would you say has been the linchpin critical factor to open up this space for the flourishing of Indigenous businesses in Canada? I mean, has there been a shift in the access to financing? Has there been a shift in the mindset? I think you did kind of mention that, but what has there been an enabling and policy environment? What is it if we wanted to support that type of Indigenous entrepreneurship across the world? What would you say are the 2-3 critical factors that we need to look at replicating?
Well, I think one is advocacy. Communities have been advocating, as you pointed out in the work that you do, for recognition of their rights and land. I think the other thing, if you look at the Harvard Project, that institutions matter. There's been a number certainly over the last 10, 15 years of new institutions that deal with capital, community economic development, economy. There's been a big movement for community development corporations. So a lot of these institutions are kind of bubbling up in the community, and people are learning from each other what seems to work and what fits best for First Nations, Inuit, Métis communities. The other area is schools. I think First Nations schools are evolving and changing on a rapid basis, and also at the university level, there's many more Indigenous people that are teaching at universities. They're changing the universities. In Canada, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, which have really forced universities to really think through we'll call it the colonial mindset that universities have had to adapt and adopt Indigenous approaches to learning. Kyle Bobbywash is one of them, and there's dozens of other Indigenous people that are teaching at universities that are not only transforming Indigenous students' way of thinking, but also non-Indigenous students' way of thinking. Last year, I taught a course in Indigenous community health and wellness, and that's incorporating all the latest evidence. And then, so I think there's a lot of changes going on, and I'm really excited about the young people. There's one of my students started a social enterprise here in Ottawa, and it just they're supporting each other. It's run by young Indigenous people that are in an urban center, and they support each other. They've got some really interesting business development. So it's just bubbling up all over, and I think this is the front end of it. And when you talk to the people that think about these things about capital, they're saying we need 4 times as much capital that's available. We need new institutions, like internationally. I think internationally, Indigenous people and women are saying we're not getting a fair share of that international money. And I've done some work in health, and the Canadian Institute for Health Research increased their funding level from 1% to 4.5%, which is proportional to the population. And I was the chair at the time, and what we did was we developed policy that enabled non-university, like friendship centers and communities to be research leads. And we did that through submit a proposal. And they would submit a proposal. It would say, this proposal needs this or that. And then we would give them the money, provide them the money to develop the proposal the next year and come back. So we need that kind of innovative approaches to institutional development. And I could see the World Bank doing that too.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon. With the last few minutes, I'd like to turn to you, Harry. And same question for you. Is there something you would like to highlight from what others have said, and or do you have a question for one of the panelists?
Yeah, thanks, Jill. Both, actually. I think that we've come full circle on recognizing that the problem of economic development is the solution for that is something that recognizes both the climate issues, the environmental issues, and Indigenous peoples' management of their own land, their sovereignty. And the question to Fawn is, what role can research play to help make this happen? I think Diana presented some good opportunities, mechanisms for financing to get to Indigenous communities somehow, but to go one step further, where these solutions combine both the sovereignty with the environmental protections and employment generation. And I think that's where I think research could help, but maybe Fawn can tell me what exactly research can, if it can, help in making all of this a reality.
Yes. Thank you. I really appreciate that question. One of the things that I think would be very helpful, we're trying to translate our success that the world is starting to understand at a very high level to financial metrics. And so I think as the world is making direct investments in Indigenous communities, we need to understand non-financial reporting data. How do we translate our performance, overperformance by 400% to economic systems and structures that will look at valuation of nature through our lens? And I think if we could do some research around that, it's going to create a very compelling case. And I think as the climate crisis intensifies and as boards are being sued by shareholders for not managing their investment against climate risk, there's going to be a stronger desire to make a case for a return, not only on the investment in terms of profitability, but the return on the investment in actually making a difference to improve the biodiversity, our oceans, our landscape, our forests. And I think the key to that really is Indigenous knowledge and metrics. And the world knows at a very high level, we're very successful, but how do we get down into the details to prove those metrics? And I think that's going to be very important going forward.
That is fascinating. And it reminds me of a conversation that I just had with the director of the organization Cielo in Mexico that Harry mentioned in his earlier comments. He makes the exact same point that you do. It's fascinating. I wish we had more time, but I think we're out of time. I'd love to convene this group again. This has been fascinating. Thank you all.
Well, thank you.
Big Rich.
Thank you.
you.